Jamie, we're here to talk about sulfur today. Why is sulfur important for alfalfa production?
When we think about sulfur, sulfur is highly needed by alfalfa, so it is a huge consumer. So we're looking at a need of about 5 to 6 pounds of sulfur per every ton of dry matter. So a considerable amount compared to some of our other crops. So that sulfur is important not only in protein synthesis, so when we look at these forage crops, we definitely want to make sure that we have the protein levels that we need to produce a high quality forage, and that sulfur is also used in nodule formation. So in a legume crop, we need those nodules to help us produce that nitrogen. So sulfur is imperative to have at sufficient levels in an alfalfa system.
Awesome. To get to those levels, Jamie, what are some management practices that we could do?
So when we look at sulfur and managing those potential deficiencies, first we have to recognize that deficiencies have become more prevalent over the past couple decades. One of it is improved air quality, so we're getting less atmospheric deposition, but also these are really high production systems. And so as we remove more tonnage, we're removing more sulfur. So making sure that we understand our environmental conditions, our management conditions, and how that impacts sulfur availability. So for example, Dan, sandy soils tend to be more deficient in sulfur. The reason for that is sulfate is an anion. It easily leaches through the soil, not as easily as nitrate, but it does move through the soil, so we need to be more conscious on sandy soils. Organic matter produces about 3 pounds or so of sulfur for every 1% organic matter. So low organic matter soils are oftentimes have the higher potential for sulfur deficiencies. In addition, those fields that don't receive manure. Manure can be an excellent addition of sulfur into the system. For example, dairy manures, what do we estimate?
Right, about a pound per 1,000 gallons of dairy manure of sulfur.
So many states, when we look at these, if the manure hasn't been applied to a field within the last 2 years, we're looking at potential sulfur deficiencies. And so we're going to go out and assess that using potentially tissue tests or sometimes soil test. And so when would we use a tissue test? When would we use a soil test?
Right, so the soil test isn't necessarily calibrated for sulfur in alfalfa. So we would go to a tissue test, and we're going to sample the petioles and send those off to the lab based on the lab and local extension recommendations to get some data back that we can use to assess if it was actually sulfur or not. I guess one of the things is we want to make sure that we're managing the entire system. We don't have any look-alike symptoms like say leafhopper burn, or we don't have a pH issue, because those areas are going to be really stunted and really yellow, but again, there could be other things, especially pH, going on out in the field. So taking the time to assess those, I think, is essential too. Once we get some data back, or once we're very comfortable knowing that it's a sulfur deficiency, then we could come back with a commercial fertilizer. I would say that a good commercial fertilizer application of 20 to 30 pounds of a sulfate form of sulfur would be a base area to start, but what would you have to say about that?
I would agree. So we're going to look at our state recommendations. So soils, in some states who have heavier textured soils, so those loamier or heavier textures, are recommending somewhere in that 10 to 25 pounds of sulfur top dress. But for those of us that work with sandier soils, we're in lower organic matter soils, we're more used to that 25 to 30 pounds of sulfur top dress to that alfalfa. I also wanted to clarify, when we think about timing of those tissue tests, that's really important. So in a dairy production system, many times we're looking at those tissue tests, and when you say petiole testing, I'm not a plant person, you can tell. I'm a soils person, Dan's a plant person. A petiole testing, what we're really talking about is the top 6 inches of growth being harvested from a given area, and that's about 35 stems or so from 30, and we're going to take that close to early bud. So in a dairy production system, we're usually not letting the system get much more mature than that. So right at that early bud seems to correlate well and identify well with that sulfur deficiency. So if we do identify that sulfur deficiency, Dan, sulfate versus elemental sulfur. So I have the option of those 2 fertilizers and realize there's lots of different sulfates out there, but if I had to choose between a sulfate and an elemental, which would I choose?
Right, so I'd choose the sulfate form, Jamie, because it's going to be much more plant available. The elemental would be good, say pre-plant incorporated, but would not be the tool of choice to address a deficiency because of that plant availability factor. We're going to see a almost immediate yield response from that sulfate form, whereas that elemental is going to be very difficult to see because of the plant availableness of it.
Excellent, Dan. So when we think about the take-home points, 1, alfalfa needs a lot of sulfur.
It does.
2, deficiency symptoms are becoming more and more common, particularly in high production systems, and as our environment changes, as air quality improves and we get less atmospheric deposition. 3, soil testing versus plant tissue testing.
Right. Stick with tissue testing for this case. It's really important to have good soil test data, especially for pH with alfalfa and potassium removal, but stick with those tissue tests.
And what are we going to apply?
We're going to apply sulfate forms of sulfur.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Hopefully we learned a little bit about sulfur.
Thank you, Jamie.